Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 9 of BAMEOTUK UK podcast channel on YouTube. This episode is Let's Talk White Supremacy, the Construct and Occupational Therapy. Yes, what a timely and much needed topic to discuss in occupational therapy. I have a across countries panel today from the Atlantic, South Africa and UK representing. I am going to ask the panel, if they would, to introduce themselves, and then I think we will start the conversation. So who'd like to start first? Frank?
Yeah, that'll be fine. That'll be fine. My name is Frank Kroneneberg. I'm originally a native of the Netherlands, but since 2005 I refer to Cape Town, South Africa as my new home, and for my family as well. I've been an occupational therapist since 1999, and I'm a co-founder of what is referred to as a movement, Occupational Therapy Without Borders, which has produced a couple of international publications. And I am the chair of the board of directors of an NGO called GAPA, which stands for Grandmothers Against Poverty and AIDS, which is a Cape Town-based NGO. And I've been working with them since 2010. And what else can I just throw in here? Yes, maybe my African name. My African name, Isikosa name, is Nyaniso. And Nyaniso means the one who speaks his true mind from the heart. And this was a name that was given to me after 3 years of working in the local Xhosa community. And they says, well, we have experienced you to be that, the one who speaks his true mind from the heart. So, and they says, and we really think that that's who you are and that that's what you have to live up to. So that's what I intend to do today as well.
Thank you, Frank. Sheela, would you like to go next?
Yes, thanks for having me, Mish. So I'm Sheela Ivelev. My pronouns are she, her, and I thought I'd take a moment to talk about my maiden name, which is Roy, but it's actually Datta Roy Chaudhry. So speaking of white supremacy, the British came and they changed our names and made them easier to pronounce. So that's a little bit about my history. My family is from India and Bangladesh, so Mish and I share some heritage, and I am in the United States in San Francisco. I have a private practice in mental health, and I do quite a few different things with occupational therapy. I recently started a BIPOC occupational therapy practitioners group. Thanks to Mish, I was inspired to do a South Asian occupational therapy experience podcast as well to talk about, culture-based occupational therapy. And I'm also on my police alternatives committee here in San Francisco, finding ways to basically provide better services to our community and not involve police in welfare checks, mental health, and homelessness.
Thank you, Sheela. Very interesting. Juman, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Juman Simaan with a guttural a. That's the Arabic a. It has to be. Normally, it will have an apostrophe after the A, but somehow we spelled our name with 2 A's, so it's Simaan. Simaan is the Arabic for Simon, by the way, or Shim'on in Hebrew. If we're talking about names, that's my name. I am Palestinian, and I graduated as an occupational therapist in 2000, so a year after Frank. And at the moment, I live in the southeast of England, and I'm a senior lecturer in occupational therapy at Canterbury Christchurch University.
Thank you, Juman. Mary Lynn, would you like to go next?
Sure. So thank you for having me here today. So my name is Grenier. My pronouns are she or they. I do identify as non-binary and queer, so that's sort of in there. I'm originally from Cornwall, Ontario, which is Mohawk Indigenous Territory in Canada. I currently live in Montreal in Quebec, and I worked a little bit in the States after I graduated from OT school. I'm identify as white, and my family, are white settlers. I'm not actually sure of my origins, but I'm assuming French because of my name. So if we're going to talk about names, also Catholic, so that's also a little bit in my name. You can see that Marie Lynn there, so Catholic heritage. And yeah, so I graduated in occupational therapy from the University of Western Ontario in 2010. I then worked a little bit in the United States in Philadelphia for about 6 years. And now I teach at McGill University in Montreal. So I've been doing that for about 6 years as well. I'm a faculty lecturer there, and I teach a whole range of different things. And I'm also a PhD student. So I'm busy right now, but I'm doing a PhD in education right now, specifically looking at how we're teaching about, white supremacy, racism, intersectionality, all of that in healthcare professions education. And that's a little bit about me.
Oh, yes, solidarity with that PhD, definitely. Dave, you and me, yes. So that segues into Dave Thomas. Thank you.
Wow, as if I could forget that I'm doing a PhD. You've just reminded me. My God, that is the haunting, by the way. So for anyone who hasn't done a PhD before, I can only equate it to a haunting. You're either doing it, thinking about doing it, or actually having done it, right? So anyway, I'm Dave Thomas. And whilst we're on names and origins, so I am the finest export from Jamaica. I was born in Jamaica, born and raised in the colony, so to speak. Now we're talking about white supremacy. And I now reside in the metropole in the southeast of England. So I graduated from my occupational therapy degree back in 2014. And ever since, I've been working in higher education in roles relating to diversity, inclusion. I'm as non-traditional as you might find it as an occupational therapist. I'm more interested in social justice and occupational science specifically. So that is my thing, advocating for the marginalized, the oppressed, and actually for moral consciousness, just doing the right thing. So that's what I'm all about. I'm about bringing people together, and I'm about unity, and I'm about redressing structural inequalities. That's what keeps me awake at night, along with my PhD. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I better introduce myself. My name is Mushrat Ahmed-Landeryou. Everyone knows me as Mish. I am British Bangladeshi, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And welcome everybody to BAMEOTUK UK podcast. I'm going to start off with that first question. Let's get on to it. What do we mean by white supremacy in occupational therapy? Who'd like to start us off?
So I'm in the United States, and in the past 7 days, we've had several mass murders. We're very well known for that, right? We don't like giving up our guns. And so white supremacy, I would think that the majority of people think it has to do with white domestic terrorism, the KKK, hateful violence. And it is a lot more subtle than that as well. It's all of those things, but it includes white norms and white dominant culture. And so in occupational therapy, we go back to the roots of occupational therapy in 1917 and think about what was your country like back then. Occupational therapy started in the United States. It was made by and for white people. So the roots of our country, the roots of white supremacy are really in the structure, the fabrics of the origin of occupational therapy. And, I'm just going to ask, what's changed since then? Not much has changed since then. So we still have white supremacy in occupational therapy.
Thank you for starting us off. I think that is nicely explained in that it is a construct. Yes, it's not just terrorism. It is a construct. It is a group of people's beliefs put upon other people. Yes, and we've advanced in occupational therapy, but we haven't advanced in that respect. We're still ethnic neutral in that respect. Who'd like to add anything else to that question?
I agree with Sheela that white supremacy is not only the acts of violence that are done against ethnic minorities. I mean, I come from Palestine, and in Palestine, almost on a daily basis, white supremacy kills Palestinians. For us, even in Palestine, it's the ideology and practice of settler colonialism, Western central settler colonialism, as white supremacy in Palestine is expressing violence on a daily basis. So for me, as a someone who was born and brought up as a minority within our own country, as in other settler colonial contexts, we felt as foreigners in our homeland. And with that, I express solidarity with First Nations in North America, Australia, New Zealand, South America, and Latin America in general. So in that way, that is kind of how white supremacy was expressed in my life. In terms of occupational therapy, and I like Marie-Lynn in a read your paper about it, and you used the definition of D'Angelo, and she describes white supremacy as the all-encompassing centrality and assumed superiority of people defined or perceived as white. But I often connect white supremacy with white privilege. And I like the definition of white privilege by Edo Lodge from 2018, and she's a UK-based journalist, and she defined white privilege as, when I talk about white privilege, I don't mean that white people have it easy, that they've never struggled or that they've never lived in poverty. But white privilege is the fact that if you're white, your race will almost certainly positively impact your life's trajectory in some way, and you probably won't even notice it. It's almost similar to me being male, or because I look male, I have the privilege that I get from just the fact that I look like male. For that, I may be in positions higher than similarly qualified persons who may look like women or identify women, get paid more. And this doesn't happen, by the way, in occupational therapy, at least from my lived experience and anecdotal evidence. Men have more privilege than women in occupational therapy. They are in higher positions, for example. They are paid more in the UK, at least. And white supremacy and privilege come from the same system as male supremacy and privilege, what Bill Hooks calls imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. So I think it all comes into the same thing, and how it's expressed in occupational therapy, as I said, there is an assumed privileged or norm, the kind of the white dominating norm in occupational therapy practice, theory, philosophy, and intervention. So that's me.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Juman, because and definitely Sheela for laying that platform. But you know what? I always preface any conversation around the issue of white supremacy by actually establishing what we mean when we say white supremacy. So disaggregating the ideology from the identity, right? So just to say, when we speak about white supremacy, specifically, we're talking about the structure, right, that ratifies discrimination, right, instead of the people, the identity, because that's very important. We don't want to individualize white supremacy at the inception. It has to be systemic, institutional. So I like the way Neely Fuller Jr. puts it, you know, when he says, if you don't understand systemic or institutional racism, that is racism plus power, what and how it works, then everything else you understand will only confuse you. So really, to go back to the foundation, we're talking about a superstructure here that ratifies all the disparate and discriminate acts and atrocities historically. And then if I speak specifically now about how that manifests itself in education, and not just occupational therapy education, right? I mean, across the sector. So we know that as a result of this superstructure, this hegemony, you know, students or people of color, people who are classified as not belonging to the dominant population in that sector, not global majority we're talking about here. We're talking about within this institution, the dominant, right, culture. If they don't see themselves or their cultures or the problems of their cultural communities acknowledged, right, affirmed or treated sensitively, then they'll be more likely that they won't, right, feel empowered to interact well in this community, and they won't feel a sense of belonging. So basically, they're going to be othered because the subliminal messages are telling them that, or telling us, I would say, that you are not welcome. So if we can think about how this superstructure now starts ratifying these disparate behaviors, stratifying people based on demographic characteristics and the intersections thereof, and promoting these inequalities, I think that now becomes a way of illuminating, you know, the barriers that we face as a society of people. So I would always say this problem is not a BIPOC problem, people of color problem, a Black problem. It's a problem for humanity. It definitely is a problem for all of us, because if it affects one group, then by virtue of the ecosystem in which we cohabit, it will affect everyone.
And if I could add to that, I like this idea of the superstructure, because and to link that to the word construct as well, because I think construct gets misunderstood or misappropriated in a way that people think it's a theoretical thing and it only resides in the theoretical. But we also have to think of it, I think, white supremacy as a very real form of currency and property that becomes a very tangible, literally a tangible thing. And there's this idea, you know, in critical race theory of whiteness as property, right? So whiteness as this very tangible thing that you come to own, that then, you know, allows you to have good health, which again is a very tangible thing, to, you know, grow wealth, which is a very tangible thing as well. So, you know, Juman, you mentioned the definition that I presented in the paper, and I've since sort of like moved past that. I love this piece of academia where you sort of write something and then 2 years later you're like, this is I don't believe this anymore. This idea of whiteness, I still, you know, that's a piece of it. This idea of whiteness as the norm and sort of this understood, you know, norm within our society. But I've come to think about it in more almost capitalist kind of ways, like in a very tangible form of property. So I don't think of it only as a construct anymore. I think of it also, you know, yes, there is the theoretical piece, there's the ideology, but that sort of overarching system that is at play leads to very, very tangible things that you can hold and feel and touch, including your own health, which I think is a very tangible thing. So I've sort of, my definition is evolving of white supremacy over time.
I think what I'll say to you, my friend, is like when they say Malcolm X says racism is like a Cadillac. Every year they invent a new model. So I suppose what I'm saying here is, don't feel guilty because it's evolving, because it's being recreated in more sophisticated ways. As we can see it happening in front of our very eyes, right? So the mechanisms to detect this white supremacy, it almost becomes outdated as soon as we create it and acknowledge it, right? So yes, it's a movable feast, as they say.
I don't want to interrupt because I know that Frank wants to say something, but I really agree with Dave that white supremacy evolves. And in the UK at the moment, we have a woman of color head of the Home Office whose policy that she is putting for Parliament for people seeking refuge is the extreme of white supremacy. So white supremacy is used by privileged people of color in the Tory government of the UK to suppress more and more people of color at the moment. So in that way, in the UK, we have evolved in that kind of white supremacy and racism to be implemented by people of color, even a woman, a person of color, Priti Patel. An awful ideology of a Tory government that she's taken to the white supremacist and I'm talking about this because I am really passionate about occupational therapy, working with people seeking refuge. Way she is really putting barriers to people's being included in society or actually entering this society.
When you said that, Juman, it reminded me of Audre Lorde's that master-servant relationship. And I feel, in my opinion, what is going on there is particularly that comes across to me, and this whole two-tier system about who's worthy to seek refuge just because on their travel journey. So you're not worthy because you took a greater risk to find safety. It just seems bizarre to me, but that's another conversation. Frank, over to you.
Well, it's absolutely fascinating to just sit and listen, and to be part of indeed a conversation, a dialogue about a topic, a very heavy topic, a very loaded topic, that most people do not care, definitely not people who look like me, if I can put it plainly like that, are often interested in even dialoguing about. Forget about discussion, forget about debate. But what I really appreciated is that how you phrased the question, you said what do we mean with white supremacy? And then in relation to occupational therapy, right? So in that I immediately felt okay, so who does we refer to here? Because it was put forward with such comfort, and considering that, everybody who is watching this now and listening to this can see that from the screen. There seems to be a where the 6 individuals that now are having this conversation seem to be quite at ease with one another, So this does not reflect the reality out there. But we are embodying it here as we are dialoguing about an issue that is just very uncomfortable, right? So that's the first point. So the second point is that I think it is important, particularly with issues that are so difficult and controversial, is that we indicate upfront or disclose upfront our particular positionality towards the issue, right? And you can use big language, from decoloniality scholarship, like Walter Mignolo and others have called it the body and biographical and geopolitical positioning that one embodies, and then say, from that particular positioning, how do you then approach this issue and make sense of it, and engage in dialogue about. So if I were to apply that briefly to myself and say, like, all right, the body that I'm born into is white. Right? And the country that I'm born into and the community that I grew up in, the little town in the south of the Netherlands, was also 99.9% white. So if that is the world that you're born into and the body, you don't start thinking about like, hey, I am white. You have no consciousness of white, the white part of white supremacy. So that means that the being in the world and then being exposed to the world little by little may get you to the point that you start to become conscious of the fact that, hey, I am this, and I grew up with only people that look like me and talk like me and eat like me, But I'm finding out now little by little that's not true for the whole world. So that some people talk different, look different, etc., right? So I want to say that my first memory of taking note of, being aware of, and becoming sensitive about white supremacy was more linked to the supremacy part. And that is, as a 6-year-old, every day with my brothers and sisters, delivering the daily bread in mental health institutions in my local town, because we had a bakery at home. Our clients were people with mental health issues who were residents in those institutions. There were Catholic nuns who were looking after their everyday needs. And there were, and here comes the word white for the first time, white coats, the psychiatrists and the therapists and the nurses who were interacting obviously with the nuns and with the so-called patients, the mental health people with mental health issues. And I picked up as a kid, without having any language, but something in me that was not language-based, that was not definition-based, told me like something's fishy here, something's funny. It seemed as if those white coats, who also happen to all be white, but I mean it's the white coats that matters here, were interacting with the nuns and with the mental health issues users as if they were better than them, as if they were smarter, so in a way superior to them. I didn't have the language, but if you talk to me now, I mean, I'm getting goosebumps now when I speak to you about it, because this was my first awareness and sensitivity, or becoming sensitive to people who think that they are better than. And I think that was the seed, or like the critical incident moment where I said, like, well, I have developed since then an almost zero tolerance for people who present themselves as better than the next person. And my parents have inculcated that in us, have instilled that in us, that nobody's better than the next person. And the great equalizer in our shop was that everybody who came to eat our bread, no matter who they were, right? So that's the supremacy part of white. But where did white come in when it becomes race-based is that Franciscan missionaries, I was also raised Catholic, came to our town to show pictures, slides of projects that they were carrying out in the global south. Yeah? And in those pictures, for the first time, I saw that people who look different and talk different, etc., etc. And I think this is where the first reasoning, at the reasoning level, occurred when I started to say, like, I started to make the link between white missionaries carrying out projects, development projects, education, healthcare, and what have you, with people who look different from us, and then making the link as a child, as a school child, like it seems to be that people who do not look like us, who do not talk like us, who do not eat our kind of food, need our help. Somehow they struggle with getting their lives on track. School child still, eh? School child. And when I then fast forward, when I graduated in my first degree as a school teacher, primary school teacher, that question came back to me. I wanted to say, like, well, for me to become a good teacher, I need to find out about the story or the stories behind what is this about, that people that look like us need to help people that do not look like us, right? Again, without the language of white supremacy or whiteness or any of those things. And I wanted to find out not by reading books, but through traveling and working abroad. And then again, fast forward. This white body from the Netherlands, from this little hometown, then at some point, after having coined occupational apartheid in occupational therapy, arguably the most controversial concept in our discourses to date, through that term, I met Ivelev, also an OT, South African, black, who now is the mother of our two so-called mixed-race children. And as I said earlier, now home is Cape Town, South Africa. So now the positioning of approaching white supremacy in occupational therapy has radically changed. Right? Had I always remained in our little hometown and actually never gotten exposed or exposed myself to differences and to interrogate those differences, I don't think I would be sitting here with you today. Right? But I think the important thing that I just to bring that back is the lived experience and one's reaction to it evolving to white supremacy, so superiority of one particular race historically, and how that then manifests within occupational therapy. The overwhelming numerical majority of white bodies that make up the collective body of occupational therapy, one manifestation. The second one is, as a consequence of that, is the collectively intergenerationally lived experiences of that overwhelming white body. And then thirdly, and probably most tellingly, is the unequal power relations. So the dominant power relations, white power relations, that shape occupational therapy. Because the numerical power, the collective white experience, and then on top of that, if you look at who occupies the seats where decisions are made as to education, research, practice, governance structures, it's white up to the as much as the universe can take up. It's like all PowerPoint slides are white. All pages that black text is printed on are white. So white is omnipresent, but obviously unquestioned, because those who make up the majority cannot see that. And once it's pointed out, I understand it's way too disruptive to then have a conversation about. But there's no running away from it. No running away from it.
Yes, and I think this little group of disruptors and collaborators is trying to engage with the fact that there's no running away from it. And like Mary Lynn said, and Juman said, knowledge changes, and Dave said knowledge changes and evolves, but we haven't done that in occupational therapy. We're recycling the same white bodies to keep leading the narrative and the research and the conversation. And on the edges are, well, not you, Frank, on the edges are people like Sheela and me and Juman and Dave and Marilyn, trying to push you. You're in the thick of it, Frank, because you've got some name behind you. So you can be more of a mover and shaker, and we will join in collaboration with you. But we want to be movers and shakers because we, in every point, need to make noise about it. Because I think, getting more frustrated, but getting more calmer at the same time. I don't know if that makes sense to you, that my tolerance for the injustice is higher, but then is motivating me at the same time. And Dave keeps telling me about keep that collaborative conversation going, because that's what's going to keep this alive and inch by inch moving some change, inch by inch. So I'm going to go on to the next question. What is, or how have we seen the consequences and outcomes of white supremacy in occupational therapy for our, I think, knowledge and students and practitioners and service users? What's been the impact from continuing this recycling of white supremacy? Who'd like to take that one?
Yeah, well, I think that's a massive question, but I would want to just to chew off a portion of that question and leave the rest of my colleagues here. And thanks, Mish, for putting together that beautiful question. If ever there was a beautiful question, that is one, right? When I read that question, immediately my thoughts are pointed towards the obvious, right? The COVID-19 pandemic, right? And then the even more obvious, the advent of this new cultural and social and racial awakening globally, right? And I can't help but wonder if it isn't even more obvious that in terms of health and well-being, that is shaping the lives of people globally. Unquestionable, right? It's unquestionable. There must be a consensus around that. So what I'm saying here is the idea of race and all the intersections, right, is significant, not just for people who are racialized as being in the minority, but for everyone, right? So Professor Kevin Hilton, he says it beautifully. He says, and I'll read this because I had to find it to read it. He said, the term race is significant for me, not just as a socially constructed concept, but as a significant ontological truth, right? Not a socially constructed concept, but a significant ontological truth. And then it leads us to think that race is also a paradox, right? Right? So you have to acknowledge the dilemma in, destabilizing this notion of race. Like, we want to destabilize it, but recognizing its lived presence. You understand me? So back to, my open arguments. If we look at the pandemic and how this idea of race and racialization shape the life chances for people, really, going back to your question, it's significant for us as occupational therapists and as a discipline to engage in these conversations. We can't exempt ourselves from these conversations because that is what's trending in the world right now. You understand? So it's an intersection between these racialized identities and health inequalities. And that's shaping the life chances for people globally. So yeah, I'll leave it there and open the floor to my colleagues. I'm really, really interested to hear their perspectives on this.
Yeah, when I read that question, I agree. It's a fabulous question. The first thing that came to my mind was death, particularly for service users. And it's a word that I don't think we talk about. It's a word that we, as occupational therapists, sometimes like to think we are so far removed from that our impact can't possibly lead to that, to death. And I don't think we talk about that enough, particularly in Canada. I'm speaking about genocide and our contributions to genocide, which is somewhat acknowledged in Canada in terms of the genocide of Indigenous folks on those lands. But we haven't been investigating our role in that. So for example, the role of occupational therapists, there's a fabulous book, and I wish I'll find it by the end of the session at some point, but talks about the role of occupational therapists specifically in the whole mechanism of removal of Indigenous children from their families, placement into residential schools and what at the time were called Indian hospitals, which led to massive amounts of deaths. 50% of children, Indigenous children who were placed into the residential schools died. And OTs actually had a really big role in that in terms of, assessments, evaluations on children, getting the families onto the radar of the youth protection services and things like that at the time. And none of that is acknowledged. And, while we don't have residential schools today, we don't have Indian hospitals necessarily today, the way they were designed, 50 years ago, we have more children in foster care today than we ever had in residential schools and Indian hospitals combined. Like today, there is more Indigenous children in the foster care system. So, and OTs again play a huge role in assessments. And, again, we feel like we're so far removed, and we know, the suicide rates are incredibly high for children who are removed from their communities and families and their cultures and their traditions, etc. And yet it's because we're not injecting someone, we're not, performing surgery on someone, we tend to think that we're not really part of that system, and that death piece, the genocide piece, is just not to the forefront. It's not in our minds. So when I read that question, I sort of jumped a little bit more to the service users, but that was the example that came to mind, just, within the context of Canada, where I am, the huge role that we have in contributing to death, and people are not talking about it enough. So as far as consequences, that's a really important one that I think we need to be talking about more as a profession.
I wanted to jump in. What you said, Marie-Lynn, really makes me think about the more recent conversations that I've had, presentations I've done on this topic with practicing occupational therapists. They really don't want to get into the social and political impacts. They really don't want to get into the history. They don't want to know about me being born in a racialized society, not having a choice in being an other, and knowing that I was different from the moment that I was able to speak and interact with others. They don't want to know about how slavery was abolished, but then we had 100 years of Jim Crow, that the apartheid ended only in 1994, right, in South Africa. So we're really not that far removed from the history of things like segregation and genocide. And, they don't want to talk about that the genocide still persists, it still continues. And so they want to hear it. And I say they, this is my experience. People want to hear the simplified version of it, the simplified version based on like ADLs and what's happening now. I don't want to really talk about the history because that has nothing to do with today. And I disagree with that completely. But if you want to simplify it and make it digestible for what does this have to do with occupational therapy, it's the overrepresentation of white occupational therapy students and professionals, right? In the United States, we're like 84% white. And I think population demographics is about like 70% white. So we're overrepresenting white practitioners in society. And when you look at who our assessments, treatments, and things like goals are normed for, they're normed for white service users. And so if you're a white practitioner, that is the norm for you. That's how you view life. That's what is important to you. But when you're looking at the people that you're serving that might not have the same lived experience as you, then your assessments don't match, your treatments don't match, your goals don't match, right? Don't match the needs of people like myself. We're missing things like screens. We're misunderstanding people's culture and background. We're discontinuing services too early. And we're really providing better services, more access to white users, and there's less services to occupational therapy, poorer quality services to people that aren't white. That's really the bottom line of what's happening today in occupational therapy.
Juman.
Yeah, I just, you guys speaking about it. I mean, I have emotions, and I think affect is very important here, and just express my sadness and anger about the historical influences over our lives at the moment. But just to say that in Palestine, Israel, actually, we're still experiencing segregation and apartheid-like circumstances. So it's still happening till this day. So it hasn't gone. One example that came to mind, especially when Frank was speaking, as a child, when I was asked to draw a house, as an adult, as an OT, when I asked children that came to me to draw a house, if they were Palestinian children, they would draw a house. We Palestinians live traditionally in a one-story, like, square box house, but Palestinian children would draw a house like Westerner live in, two-story house with like a triangle kind of roof, and it looks like a cottage with lovely conifer trees outside. In Palestine, we don't have many conifer trees, even pine trees. And in occupational therapy assessments for children, we ask children to draw these houses, and we actually have criteria, like for each section of the house. If they don't have them, they will lack something. So in that way, white supremacy functions in occupational therapy, for example, in that way, in assessments we do. But actually white supremacy, it functions within those who are survivors, if you like, of white supremacy and racism, or those who are carrying the brunt of white supremacy. As a minority child living, I mean, my parents live in Nazareth, which is a Palestinian city, but within Israel. So I always saw the norm, not my norm. The norm was white, Western, Israeli, Jewish, or American, or English. That is the norm for me. That is the thing that I aspired for. So, you know, in comparison to Frank's experience, Frank's never seen any other thing. I actually saw the other as a norm, and I othered myself in that way. So it's kind of complicated, isn't it? It's like it's within us, white supremacy within us, those who are carrying the consequences of white supremacy. It's in OT interventions and assessments, for example, that thing. Also, I think white supremacy in occupational therapy is when you take things for granted without questioning the power dynamics that have helped create our knowledge, our theories, our teaching methods and interventions. For example, in higher education, in occupational therapy courses, we hold, you know, the classification system, assessment, particular assessment methods as the norm. And we're really scared of going beyond that norm. But also, you also reminded me when you were speaking about how occupational therapists in Canada are involved in white supremacy. In the UK, we are involved in white supremacy by, for example, policing. Occupational therapists are policing who's worthy and who's not worthy of receiving services. You know, again, the example of people seeking refuge without British citizenship. We don't give them services because they're not worthy of that. So we police who's worthy to be defined as human and who's not a human. So that's white supremacy in the UK, implemented by occupational therapists.
I'm absolutely spot on. And I think when you're speaking about knowledge, you know, you touched a nerve there when you spoke about knowledge, specifically for me, because I'm thinking about the occupational therapy education and the extent to which people who are not positioned in the dominant demographic groups believe that they can construct knowledge in the discipline of occupational therapy. I think that is particularly problematic from where I have seen it. I mean, on a personal level, I've constructed and disseminated my knowledge outside of the profession, and it has been well received. So I know personally that I can do that, but I'm wondering, you know, to what extent do my colleagues and fellow students, you know, in the discipline who are not from within the dominant population believe that they can construct these knowledges, believe that they can publish research, they can conduct research and publish findings. Do our students actually see this as a reality, you know, part of their future possible selves? Do they see themselves as the next Juman Simaan, right? Is that possible? Are there enough Juman Simans there, you know, for them to be inspired to think, well, actually, I can publish a blog. I can publish a book. I can put together a few journal articles. So this is problematic because what that means is that we're in an echo chamber as a profession. We need diverse perspectives to be coming to the fore, right? And we need positive representation here. So when you speak about supremacy, any type of supremacy, it is when these knowledges, as I would say, and I'm not speaking in proper English, as people would think, right? Knowledge is plural, right? A collection of knowledge systems. When these knowledges are presented, right, to the mass, I think that is when we'll start getting to deconstruct this supremacy.
If I could add just really briefly to bounce off of what Dave, I think that's so important in terms of the consequences for students, that sense of, we like to talk about belonging, self-esteem, self-worth in occupational therapy, and yet, non-white students who are going through this education system, where is that sense of belonging? Are they leaving with lowered self-worth, sense of belonging? So it's sort of it's powerful what you said, Dave, in terms of the consequence for students, for racialized students particularly. And then for non-racialized students, for white students, it's just this total sense of belonging. Like, yeah, this totally makes sense to me. This jives exactly with the way I grew up. This, so there's almost two, we're creating practitioners, but, as students go through their training, we're creating like two entirely different experiences for students.
The last comments on earlier comments that were shared, so Thomas, Dave, when you responded to Juman, and then Marilyn responded to Dave, you were actually building up to thoughts that I was having as I was listening to all of you, and to thinking like, okay, what other angle that within this group of six has not necessarily from where we've not necessarily looked at the question, may I be able to contribute something? And Marilyn, you started earlier on by bringing death and then the larger category of genocide into the picture, which is something that we indeed do not at all speak about. It's almost like it's of another planet. It has nothing to do with occupational therapy, which of course is not true. But linked to genocide, and that also then links to what Dave was sharing, is actually epistemicide. These coincided, as white supremacy built up and unfolded globally. And I think what came to mind was a talk by Boaventura de Sousa Santos, which he presented at the Tate Gallery of Modern Art in London. You can look it up on YouTube. I will look for the link and send it to you, Mish, so maybe you can somehow incorporate it on your website. And this is the angle from where I wish to contribute now to the responding to the second question, and that is to say, well, what are the consequences for occupational therapy as an idea and occupational therapy as an institution of white supremacy being the dominant phenomenon? And so in other words, we're now looking at who are those who are not white, non-white, racialized, etc., who are just always trying to catch up and always trying to need to follow, including clients, including students, including those who get to teach. Almost that's the obvious angle to take at this platform. But I think oftentimes when we only foreground, let's say, the experiences and the conditions of the oppressed, at times what we are not focusing enough on also is the oppressor, and how oppressing impacts the oppressor. So what is it like for people who are benefiting, mostly unconsciously, just taking it for granted because they can, that's part of the privilege? How is it actually affecting them, their personhood, at individual level and as a collective? Because I think the assumption is that no harm is caused by exercising white supremacy to the ones who exercise it. I think that's an assumption. I would argue as a hypothesis, and kind of to throw in a monkey wrench into the discussion, into the debate and the dialogue as well, is that the great idea of occupational therapy, which I still deeply believe in, I think we will never, ever tap into its full potential if white supremacy continues to take the lead. When we had in 2018 the World Congress, and the theme that the local organizing committee came up with, it wasn't a WFOT team, it was connected in diversity, positioned for impact. And it was a whitewashed version in a way of what I think it should have been, and that is connecting in diversity and positioning for impact. Position for impact or connected in diversity seemed to be we are already that, and we're celebrating that at this platform. But that's exactly the issue. We're not. This is what needs to happen. Excellence only through diversity. The idea of OT is so radical because of the appreciation for diversity that is deeply embedded in it, that the only way to give full expression to it and to make it a gift and share that gift with the world is by allowing a diversity of intergenerationally lived experiences to take the lead, jam session style, in taking the idea forward. And I think DEI, is that what DEI? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's like there's hardly anything that we can have any consensus on in the world, but it's remarkable that this particular DEI, task force, campaign, what have you, is adopted all over the world as the way to go and combat systemic racism and other oppressions. That must make us suspicious, because where does it come from? If you go back and study, where does it come from and how has it evolved since? It's the same whiteness, privilege think tanks that actually have come up with it. Very smart. I mean, gotta give them that. But it is intended to keep power relations, unequal power relations, in place. But yet, if we all jump on the bandwagon and try to implement it, actually what we're doing is we are likely undermining what we're trying to change. Right?
I would have to agree with that. Anything that makes the majority of white folks comfortable, I think, should be looked at with suspicion, or at least very much questioned. And I've given a lot of thought to that as well. This idea of diversity, equity, inclusion. It's sort of this catchphrase thing. And I think if you're not looking at those terms and you're not really reflecting on those critically, it can become dangerous. I agree. Yeah, I agree.
I just want to bring in students, really, because I have been delivering the white supremacy occupational therapy for a very long time. 18 years it's taken me to realize I've been doing that. And it made me uncomfortable all the time, but I couldn't, at that time, I didn't know that it was not just me thinking that. I always thought it was just me. I'm being difficult. I'm being awkward. Stop it, But, I've been in occupational therapy 26 years. 8 years of that was in clinical. I left clinical because of racism, because I couldn't bear it anymore. The everyday microaggressions were getting on my nerves. So I thought, I'll come to education. That'll be liberating. That'll be my emancipation. And then I quickly became that same person who was just like, there's something uncomfortable, but every time I raise it in the white majority of the lectureship, they don't get it, and I then lose my voice. I don't understand it. And then what I've done is then delivered that to my students. That that inequality, to expect inequality if you're white and if you're racialized as Black, Asian, or minoritized ethnicities, expect the inequality. How awful. I felt awful when that pain I felt when I realized that was awful, and I could not keep quiet. And I remember really from the gut screaming about it, and I feel awful. I feel like I've damaged generations of occupational therapists by colluding with this. And this leads on to the next question, because now I am a disruptor. Now I'm not keeping quiet. Now I want to create openness. I want to create uncomfortable conversations, but I want the process of action. Yeah, I don't want to just keep talking about it. I want the process of action. So this segues into my next question. I say with a smirk and a tight grin. What is the way forward to disrupt that status quo of this white supremacy and occupational therapy keep on influencing it?
But actually talking is an action. I think that kind of action of getting together to have a dialogue and conspire together, it's already an action. Our reflections within ourselves is already an action. I often hear that a lot, that we feel bad about talking and reflecting, and I think it is already an action. If you're thinking about praxis rather than practice, it starts with reflection and with thinking. So I think we should, you should give yourself a credit, Mish, because you have started already this action by providing this space to discuss and disrupt ways of thinking and collaborate and express solidarity with each other. I think that is already a big act of resistance, if you like. Yeah, I mean, just sort of add my bit that I thought about what I may answer this question before Dave. I know that you have something to say, but I'll just say that's because that's a tough one, how to do it in addition to talking. We definitely need to dismantle or help dismantling patriarchy, capitalism, and imperialism, as well as, yes, say that word, decolonize the knowledge and practice in occupational therapy. But do we do it within the institutions and the mainstream practice? I'm not sure. And in my practice as a lecturer, I talk a lot about things such as intercultural translations, ecologies of knowledges, critical reflexivities, but the fact that we should educate people to become social and political activists, impacting on the daily circumstances of the communities they live within and also globally. That's how we can start thinking about how to disrupt, in my opinion.
And I'll couple that with reparations as well, right? So the idea of decolonizing is it's a messy process, as we know, and it's not a one-lane highway. But you have to be prepared for the decolonizing, right? And what comes with it. True decolonizing is not metaphoric, as Ivelev and Yang purports, right? So we have to establish, what exactly is it that we can do? What are we able to do? What do we have the resources to do? One of the things I would want to say, though, is I'll speak to the aspect of talking about it as cathartic and as an action, right? Reparations is very important. Very, very important. It's about speaking about it, apologizing for it, and making reparations for the people who are disproportionately affected by it. The same it that we've been talking about for 62 minutes, right? We have to talk about it and make reparations. So how do we do this in the discipline of OT, in the profession of OT? It's about power, redistributing power. It's about opening the gates, and equalizing the playing field. I think that's so important. It's about establishing quick wins. I know organizations have mechanisms that they can employ to get quick wins, because you need that, right? You need that to motivate people to act and motivate other colleagues. It's about understanding that not everyone is a bad apple. So I know that there are a lot of white colleagues there who are allies and really heavily invested in this work. So it's about getting these people on board. I always say to colleagues, once we've interacted and I sense that you're interested, I'm not leaving you behind. It's a movement. This is a train ride, right? You are coming with me. You can't escape. We have to do it together. But the people who are in the power, who have the power to act, I think it's incumbent on them to act, to make reparations, to ensure that power, we redistribute this power. So important. That is the only way forward. It's about things like creating scholarships, those things are easy, right? And I say easy as in easier than the other things, right? It's about creating, grants and bursaries, creating opportunities. It's about sanctioning colleagues. And I say sanction, I mean, Dave, I see you've worked for 25 years. You have a breadth of knowledge. You're suitably qualified. We think you can be a band 6 OT now. And what we will do, we'll promote you there and give you the preceptorship to ensure that you develop the other skills necessary to act in this role. So I think it's about all of those things collectively, right? Reparations, redressing power imbalances, about collaborative action and getting the quick wins. That is the important one, quick wins.
I wanted to throw in,
sorry. Yes. No, sorry. I'm saying when I say quick wins, I don't mean the quick wins are the wins. What I mean is get those quick wins, but keep the eye on the prize. Sustainable action, sustained action, ensure that this thing is kept on the agenda, keeping it on the agenda. Sorry, Sheela.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to throw in that we have to start with admitting that occupational therapy is inherently racist and that we as individuals are perpetuating it. And I think there's it's easy to shift the blame and point at something else. Yes, it's systemic. Yes, it's institutional. But what are our roles as individuals as well in perpetuating it? And I think we can't unpack, we can't undo, we can't evaluate what really is happening if we aren't willing to admit that. So that's my little piece, is just start there, admit it, and then we can move forward.
Yeah, and absolutely, that's in my opinion the first step. I don't think we're even there yet because there's still a lot of resistance on that front. I think there's a couple of things that, not just about actions, but I think a couple of things we have to let go of. I think one is thinking that there's one way. I think that there's also, it's going to be very context dependent. What it's going to look like in Canada versus South Africa versus the UK is going to look different. It has to look different. So we need to let go of this idea that there's, this magic pill that we can just, take and it's going to make all of it go away. I think we need to slow down also. Yes, the quick wins, I think those are super, super important. But I think generally we also need to slow down. I think we're going to do things. And we said no swearing in this podcast, but we have this saying half-assed in Canada, stop doing things half-assed, like, halfway, I guess. Because I think rushing things, there's this indigenous saying in Canada that it takes 7 generations to make a really, big impact, true change in a system, these superstructures, as Dave was talking about earlier. I think we have to brace ourselves for this long-term commitment. And the other thing is this, Glenn Coulthard has a great book called The Politics of Recognition. This is particularly, I think, in Canada, we have this, this image, I think, that we like to project in the world, this multiculturalism, where we invite everyone in and that kind of thing. And it's often just based on recognition. Like we have, this Indigenous Day, in Canada, and yet we, a lot of Indigenous communities are still living without, potable water and in dire poverty, et cetera. So we're very good at recognizing, and I think we're trying to do that to our curriculums as well. We were talking about it before the podcast began, but just, this idea of just changing the name. We're recognizing that, this particular, name in a patient case, for example, and it's really based on that politics of recognition. And I think we're doing that a lot, trying to fix the issue. And it's only that it's just the politics of recognition. There's no real change that's happening underneath, often based in a competency type style. I think we have to let go of that as well. And it's really a rebuilding. I mean, Juman, you were talking about, this dismantling and rebuilding and in a way that's power shared, true power sharing.
Going back to how this group of people even came together, going to you now, Sheela. I think there's a big message in there. Like, well, you've been the connector between many of us. We're on the same screen here because You started something, and then you introduced one person to the next person, and the next person. Same with Dave and with Juman. So it is this connecting people who you have either stumbled across or who you are introduced to, which gives us a sense that, okay, yes, we are all pockets of individuals mostly, who share concerns and who have a track record of a commitment to doing something about those concerns. And I think continuing to have the conversation and to stay in touch with each other and to, again, connect other people, so that is actually what the building of a movement is about, right? OT Without Borders really was just an informal network of also people who were studying OT and who were very unhappy with how things went. And then 1 became 2, 2 became 4, and from there it moved. So I think this building or generating critical mass with regards to these very complex issues that take generations to work on and to move forward to. So this slowing down, what you said, Marilyn, it's a very, and what is slow and what is fast, right? Dave, you even put it in context by saying with quick fixes or quick wins, I don't mean this, right? So quick and fast, slow, those are relative. They're really, really context based. What I was thinking about is that when John Coltrane's album, A Love Supreme, 1964 it came out. How did that album come about? Well, first something happened. John Coltrane was kicked out of the best jazz band in the world at that point, the Miles Davis band. And all of a sudden lost everything that he was about and that he loved and that he was good at. And that made him think like, well, what happened? So there was a shock to the system, to his existence. And then he said, like, he connected with his creator and says, God, give me back my gift, and I promise I will become a prophet through my horn. And then within locking himself up for 5 days alone, he conceived the entire album inside with every note in it. It's one of the most important classical jazz albums in the world. And it consists of 4 movements, a suite of 4 movements. Acknowledgement, exactly what you said, Sheela. We first have to, recognize, admit that something is wrong. And something is so wrong that something needs to be done about it. The second movement is resolution. Agree together on what needs to happen, right? And commit to it. Third movement, pursuance. The path, or rather put paths, as you said, Marilyn, because there's not one. There will be many. There need to be many, right? And psalm is ultimately that which will come, which is where you express gratitude to the Creator, as John Coltrane would say it, for those wins that you have. Because this thing is way bigger than us, and forget about OT in the picture. Way bigger. I see it for OT actually as the ultimate litmus test of putting to the test the great idea of occupational therapy. To what extent, we can milk this idea by saying that through what we do every day, individually and collectively, we can shape our destinies, our health and well-being. Let's put it to the test and just take on one of the most complex issues, if not the most complex issue, and just go for it and commit to it intergenerationally and plant now wherever and planting is connecting, finding, being sensitive. Where are the people who we share concerns with and who have the energy and the drive to go do something about it, and connect the dots, connecting dots of concerns and commitments to collectively commit to doing something about it. Right? And I think this is happening. This is the historical moment through which we are living right now. So with all the chaos, there's also, we wouldn't have met. Right? And by that I'm not romanticizing the chaos and the suffering that it brings. But it's just a recognition of like, well, okay, what are we going to do about white supremacy within occupational therapy? Again, keeping that bigger perspective, that bigger context, keeping that in mind, and then saying like, well, we can definitely do this. We have to do it, and there's no going back. 2020 marks a game changer year. But obviously it's not going to happen when people don't take it as such and go and do the work that needs to happen. And one more thing, one thing that definitely needs to be part of what needs to happen is the calling out lies, calling out white lies, that have kept this whole white supremacy project intact. and they're very easy to call out, but the calling out just hasn't happened. Is identify them. It's almost like a calendar that you rip off every day. You rip off a date, right? I think 365 days. When you say now, by the end of this year, what do you want to have achieved? Identify one lie and rip it and rip it, and put it in the public, put it to the system, and by saying that, well, here you are misrepresenting, or here you're lying, putting it out there, and and definitely whites needing to do this. Marilyn, the two of us, we have to. We have
just
to.
The two, just the two.
Many.
Yeah.
I just want to reiterate what Frank said about Sheela. I think it's going to take this kind of relational ethics that Sheila's really demonstrated in terms of, and this is something it's new to me. I didn't grow up with this type of, with a relational ethic. It's just not part of my westernized, culture. And I just want to express a lot of appreciation for Sheela and everyone who's doing that work, Juman, Dave, etc. For you really are showing that relational ethics and bringing folks together, because it's the collective that's going to make the change in the end. It's really that and people who really share that relational ethic.
Yeah, that's super. You know what? There's a part of me that when I read question 4, I wasn't as excited as when I read question 2, because that question is sort of.
What are you saying, Dave, about my question?
I'll tell you. Question 2 excited me. Question 4, I actually reflected that question, not deflect, reflect. So I'm saying here is, by the end of the year, what does the profession of occupational therapy want to see for themselves? That is where I reflect that question. So when I say the profession, I am talking about the people who are the custodians of the profession, the people who we've probably voted in, or the people who have been entrusted to sustain this profession, to keep it alive for the next generation. In the context in which we're living now, we see everything, right? Everyone's got the memo. Everyone knows what's happening. We see inequalities. We see intersectional inequalities. We see political action. So in the light of that, what does the profession want to see happen for themselves and the people that they serve within the next 12 months? And I think if we as a profession can start being reflexive and answering that question, I think that the rest will necessarily follow, because it then points to collective occupations. And I'm looking at Frank here, right? Collective occupations, communities of practice, right? Collaboration. That's about togetherness, but we have to do it together, but the leaders need to lead from the front. And we'll support the actions, but we need everyone to be on the same page. What do we want for our profession, as in a collective we?
I think I'm going to go to Juman next, because I know that Juman's got to leave, so I just want to get his last thoughts in.
Thanks, Mish. Thank you. I agree with you all, and I might actually disagree with myself, what I said just earlier. Yes, we should talk and reflect, but we're also talking from a position of privilege. We are academics, we're practitioners, we all have a shelter to live in. I think there are communities who are living in emergencies, and change should come sooner than later. And what Sheela is doing with the policing of mental health or policing of minority, we've had a chat about this, Sheela and I, when we first met recently. And I think we really need to start dismantling these systems and give people a safe space to do the more structural issues. And I think there is emergency. We live under emergency. Yes, we need to talk and reflect, but actually I'm disagreeing with myself at the same time, saying we really need to work to change things as soon as possible. People are dying. Refugees are dying in the Mediterranean. Black men and women are dying by the police in North America. Palestinian youth are dying every day. They're being put in prison almost every day. We really need to stop that as soon as possible. And I think as occupational therapists who have the privilege of being part of a professional body, we really need to enact that duty of care, we call it. But I will let Sheela continue what I began here, because I think Sheela has got a great ideas that she articulated in words what I've always thought about. I don't know if you, Sheela, want to add something on what we talked about.
Thank you. I mean, really, the concept is people consider it radical. I don't think those of us here do. It really is abolition, right? So yes, we all want quick fixes. We want it to be comfortable. We want it to be easy. But really, we need to shift our mindsets. So in terms of occupational therapy, going back to community, right? How can the community support one another? And truly, as occupational therapists, we should be working towards being obsolete, right? Do we really need these institutions? Why are we putting people, especially mental health, why are we locking people up against their will? We should be working towards helping society function on its own, communities functioning on their own. So they don't need people like us, right? Not just police, but we really don't need occupational therapists as the experts telling people how to live their life, right? We should be working towards a society where we're not necessary and the community is taking care of one another, right? Like that really should be our ultimate goal. So can we start shifting the mindset of, are we necessary? How can we transform society so we're no longer necessary?
I love that. That's the first time I hear that. I love that.
Amen. Amen. That's absolutely
where we should be. That's where we should be. So, folks, I think I'm going to end this podcast. There might be a podcast too. It sounds like there's more stuff to talk about. And I've just been writing notes and things as you've been talking, because it's always I'm learning and I'll never stop learning. I will never be an expert because I don't want to be, because I want to be a forever learner and share that learning and get feedback and have dialogue and discourse. But one thing I am with you, Juman, and it's privilege to say slow down. I don't want to slow down. It's difficult, but I think we need to, I'm going to say, in critical race theory, it says you can do a big bang, bold, experimental approach, see what happens. And then from there, from the outcomes, start to grow those necessary changes. You don't have to wait for a, methodical approach. You can have this big bang, multi-systems. Let's get on with it.
You've convinced me. I said earlier, slow down. My fear is doing it the wrong way, but you've convinced me with the wins, with the quick wins, and yeah.
But there's no right way. This is the problem. You see the thing is, like if we shift it from OT to change management, right? With change management, a fundamental part of that process is quick wins and celebrating these wins, because what you do, you bring people on board. People see the wheels moving. What we know is historically there have been periods of great progress followed by great regression. And that is what you don't want here. You want to win hearts and minds and keep this on the agenda. So we need to make sure that we are incrementally winning. It has to be that way.
I was just saying, it's giving me pain, Dave, because my PhD is about service improvement and how quick wins are like the worst thing ever. Because, but your idea of quick win is different. I'm sure. I know your quick win idea.
What's sustainable? Think sustainable, but think about marginal gains.
Yeah.
Think about marginal gains.
Definitely. I'm going to close this down. All right. I'm taking charge now. Stop talking. Going to end this presentation now. All right. I'm collecting what you've been saying. it's magnificent just sitting here and having the chat, and I know I'm impatient and I want action. I know that I'm impatient, but I know my 26 years in the UK has made me impatient. I want change in occupational therapy, and I want the start of change. I'm not even saying it's an end point. Change is a process. It's constant, it's consistent, it's evolution, it's development. It's not a one-stop shop. I get it. But I just want them to start. Just start. That's all I want. But I'm going to end this now. Stop talking, Mish. End this podcast. Okay. Right. I just want to end with some thoughts from the discussions that we've had. When some of the members of occupational therapy try to advance the work of anti-racism, and we are met with resistance from the professional bodies and some members of the profession, this is racism. The Twitter influencer @DrawnToIntellect, do follow her, she's amazing, says, name it for what it is. This resistance is racism. And I wonder if the reason for the resistance from occupational therapy professional bodies and some members is maybe twofold, and maybe that's too reductionist, maybe it's more complex than that. But one, they do not want to equalize opportunities, level up that playing field for members racialized as Black, Asian, minoritized ethnicities and indigenous groups, as they feel they do not want to give up their privilege and power, as it would mean losing some of the benefits they gain from having it. And two, occupational therapy professional bodies and some members are uncomfortable letting go of some of their privilege and power because they fear by doing so that they will experience some of the inequalities their members racialized as Black, Asian, minoritized ethnicities and indigenous groups have had to experience most of their lives and for generations, and they don't want that. Why else wouldn't they do the right thing and explicitly enact anti-racist strategies and policies from the board to leadership and education to frontline? By resisting to do the anti-racist work, occupational therapy professional bodies are being racist. But there is always a but, isn't there? Occupational therapy professional bodies and leaders must change. They can join in collaboration and gather a large collective delivering actions with their members to disrupt this institutional racism, this white supremacy. And what happens all the time is race and health inequalities recycled in health and social care. And how do they do this? By decolonizing, I'm using that word, decolonizing recruitment, education, practice, research, health and social care, and politics. If you're in the game of social justice, then you're in the game of politics. So that, the future of occupational therapy, the landscape of membership becomes diverse and authentically delivers those core principles of the profession that we keep advertising: social justice, inclusion, and equity, and not a white constructed viewpoint of the profession. Because this is the equity that the citizens we serve deserve. Moreover, this is just the right thing to do. That's my end. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for this very needed and timely discussion. Thank you very much.
I'll play some Coltrane, Mish.